Hi, Monet.
Hi Jen, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I am good. I have a lot of clients that are kind of clustering at the end of April, and I had a really busy March and a really busy February, but everybody kind of like did that like go into labor every 2 or 3 days, so it felt pretty manageable. But
Nice.
all of my April clients are seemingly clustering at the end of the month. So I'm getting a little nervous, but hopefully I'll have at least one or two babies by this time next week. Are you on call for anybody right now?
I am. I do. I have two clients due now, and I just got through my own little cluster, but I was really worried about having clients have babies right on top of each other because I had four clients due the same week, and all four of those babies came within a month of each other. So, I mean, nobody
Um,
was even born in the same week at all. So I had no clustering with that. So I have two more
Good.
left, and then I'm off for a little bit, which will be nice.
Hi, it's Monet and Jen, and we are the co founders of Birth Becomes You. We are birth photographers and doulas with over 10 years of experience. We've attended over 1,000 births collectively. We started Birth Becomes You to create a safe space for new and experienced birth photographers to share and grow. We aim to equip and empower birth workers to feel confident in the birth space and take beautiful, world changing images. We believe in a world where birth is visible, where shame is absent, where fear is translated to power, and where each individual's experience is honored as valid and valued. We are so glad you're here, and we can't wait to learn and connect with you. I did have two clients deliver on the same day, but one was a scheduled C-section and the other was an induction, and it happened to be at the same hospital, which,
That's wild.
yeah, rarely ever happens.
Yeah.
And the induction baby was born at 7 a.m. and then my scheduled C-section was at 11. So I was able to stay like 2 hours postpartum. Then I went on a walk, I grabbed some breakfast, I called you, and then I walked back over to the hospital. And everyone was like, "What are you doing here again?" And I went back for the C-section and then I went home that afternoon. So it was, yeah, it couldn't have worked out better. So yeah, really
Yeah.
cool situation that is probably like once in a blue moon because very rarely do babies or births cooperate so nicely. But it
Right.
it was really cool and really fun to be at the hospital all day and yeah, see two very different birth stories.
Yeah. I would look at your text updates and be like, well, is she gonna make it? What's gonna happen here?
I know.
So
I was a little nervous. I was like, this induction is all gonna have to. We started pushing it like I got the call at 2 a.m. and I was like, okay. I was like, she's complete, she's 10 centimeters, 2 a.m. We're gonna make it. Like we're gonna have a baby before this other C-section happens. And it worked out great. So
yeah.
yeah.
Awesome.
Well, we are going. Last week we talked about, and again, I think these podcast episodes are going to come out at once, but when we recorded our first batch of episodes, we talked about Jen's birth story, Jen's first birth story. And today we're going to talk about my first birth story. So I guess I will just go ahead and jump in
Yeah.
and we'll travel back in time to I guess the beginning of this was all kind of started in 2012. So way back when I was in Austin, I was getting my MFA in grad school, and in the spring, my sister, my oldest sister, I have three sisters, my oldest sister was in a tragic car accident. And that's a whole long story. And I'll just give you the Cliff Notes version, I guess. But she and my nephew passed away. And then my brother-in-law died about 6 months later from a traumatic brain injury as well. And it left just one of my nephews out of that whole family. It was a really awful, horrible time, as you can imagine. My other sister, her little guy, who's named after my husband, he was in a drowning accident around that time. And so he went from this like healthy, vivacious 2-year-old to almost dying. He was in the hospital for 8 weeks, has severe cerebral palsy, just like really intense, kind of like Shakespearean tragedy that just came like one after another. And I literally felt like I had like a gray cloud like over my head. Like it was just like tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy, and big ones like suicides and car accidents and drownings, like really awful stuff was happening.
Mhm. I get choked up every time you talk about that because it's a lot.
Yeah, it
It's a
was it
lot.
was a lot, and we were like in our 20s, and at that point in your life I think you are wanting to like have fun and explore and figure out your life, and instead we were like at funerals and taking people off of life support and just awful stuff. So, as you might imagine, everyone has a different reaction to tragedy, and I think my immediate reaction was like, okay, this has been awful and horrible, and I need something like good. I need something happy. I need something life-giving. And so I decided, I like my husband Ryan and I was like, we should just have a baby. And looking back, I'm like, hey, that probably wasn't like the healthiest way to deal with trauma, but we all deal with trauma in a variety of different ways. And like, I mean, how can we really judge what is healthy and what isn't healthy? But that was kind of my reaction. And so I went into this mode of like, okay, we need to have a baby. But as you can also imagine, with all this tragedy that had unfolded in this short period of time, I wasn't really in a very healthy state emotionally or physically. I had lost like a ton of weight. I wasn't eating very well. I was super stressed. My cortisol levels were like all over the place. And so I went off of birth control and my period just didn't come back. Like it was like gone. And I was like, what the heck is going on? And I went to go see an OB, and they were like, well, you're kind of underweight, try to gain some weight. So I gained weight and my period didn't come back. And this was going on for about like a year. Could not figure out what was happening. And basically, I had hypothalamic amenorrhea, which can happen from a variety of situations. Weight loss, extreme stress are kind of two of the biggest causes. And so we couldn't get my period back. I had done all of this like dietitian stuff, weight gain stuff, and it just wasn't working. So eventually my OB was like, okay, you know what? I think you should consider going to see a fertility specialist. And at this point in time, I was like, of course, like everything is going wrong in my life. Here I am in my mid 20s. Now I can't get pregnant. Like, what else, could possibly go wrong? So I was really not in a great space, but I decided, okay, like let's pursue this kind of cautiously. I wasn't quite sure if I was ready to like do full-on fertility treatment, but I at least wanted some answers. So we saw this one fertility specialist, and he was, a male. He was from Eastern Europe, really gruff, like really intense. And I was like, I think it was my first taste of being like, okay, this is not how I want my reproductive care to go. Like I just felt like I was another number. I didn't feel like I was getting much explanation. So we saw him, and then we saw him for like a couple of cycles at that point because they were giving me medications to induce ovulation. And I was like, I can't do this anymore. I don't like this guy. So I went to another fertility specialist, and I had gotten recommendations from a few friends. She had excellent bedside manner. We met with her. She was super lovely. We spent like an hour with her, and I just really felt like seen and heard. And she said, considering like what you've done, considering your history, I really think we should talk about potentially doing IVF. And of course, knowing what I know now, I think I probably should have like pushed back on that a little bit, but I was kind of like, okay, I don't know, whatever, we'll do IVF. And so she was like, before we get started with IVF, I really would love to get like a baseline ultrasound in the office today, just to measure your uterus, check your ovaries out, do some measurements. And I was like, okay, sure. So we went back to do a transvaginal ultrasound, which, those totally suck, but whatever. Went back, and she had like her little nurse assistant with her. And, something came up on the screen, and they kind of like looked at each other and laughed a little bit. And I was like, why are they laughing? Like, what is wrong with my uterus? And she was like, Monet, she was like, I think you're actually pregnant. And I was like, are you kidding me? And she was like, no, I'm pretty sure you're pregnant. And she like showed me on the screen what was at the time just a really small, I must have been like 5 weeks. It was just like we couldn't even see a heartbeat. She was like, I want you to go. Let's go draw your blood right now. We'll take your HCG levels. We'll give you a call this afternoon. So she drew my blood and they called me. I was on the way to grad school and she was like, your HCG is like 5,000 or something. It was like a really high number. And I was
Right.
pregnant. So it was like such a weird, beautiful kind of healing start to that whole pregnancy. And I think that it's when I really look back on it, was a perfect example of how that pregnancy and how that birth and the place that it kind of fit into my life. It was truly like one of the most healing, I think, redemptive experiences I've ever had. To have so much go wrong in our family and then to have so much wrong with my body. And then suddenly it was like the cloud that had been like hovering over of us, like just kind of like moved on and it was just light and everything was, again, I'm not going to say perfect, but it was one of those just pregnancies where everything just worked really well. And I had the typical morning sickness, but after that I felt amazing. It was low risk. I moved back to Colorado to be closer to my family after I finished grad school. I defended my thesis in May and my daughter was due in June. So I like flew down to Austin to defend my thesis, graduated, and then came back home. And at the time, my older sister had had a home birth the year before. And I had thought like, like I'm into this. I knew I wanted an unmedicated birth, but I was also scared. And I think again, kind of coming back to that like history of trauma that I hadn't really processed. I think that at the time I was like, I want to be in what I thought like is the safest place if something was to go wrong. And so I had a neighbor growing up who was an OB. And so I had, she was a neighbor. Like I had babysat her kids. She knew me. And it's so interesting because I think it does harken to, why so many of us are drawn to midwifery care is that personal connection. And I just happened to have that with my neighbor OB because she had watched me grow up. And so I had an OB, but it was almost more like a midwife just because we had that. Like I had her cell number, like we saw each other like walking in the neighborhood. Every time that she came into the room, she was interested in more than just like what's your blood pressure and like how big is your belly. Like she was interested in me as a person. And I think that I was really lucky to have that. Looking back on my whole first birth, I'm like, wow, like I really just kind of lucked out because some of the choices that I made didn't necessarily set me up for success, but that's sometimes how birth
Right.
is, right? Like sometimes,
Hmm.
people can make all the right quote unquote choices and still have a really difficult birth. And sometimes people can choose like the worst hospital and the
Hmm.
worst provider and still have a decent birth because birth is not always quote unquote fair. So anyway, and my OB, I was lucky in that she had four kiddos of her own and she had had unmedicated births with all of her babies. And so when I told her that I wanted it, she was like, yeah, okay, that's fine. You can do that. She wasn't like, you're going to need an epidural. She was pretty open to it. So anyway, my due date came and went. I was like 40 weeks and 5 days. And the thing that like is interesting to me, and now that I know all of my birth histories, now that I've had four babies, she checked my cervix because that's what OBs like to do. And she would check my cervix and be like, oh my gosh, like your cervix is like, you're like 3 centimeters, you're 80% effaced, it's super soft. She was like, you have like a molt-tip cervix. And at the time I was like, I don't know if that's like a compliment or not, but it was like knowing what I know now about birth, I was like, wow, that makes sense as to why I had such a relatively fast and easy first birth because my cervix was very favorable before labor began. And my labor began, I kind of started having like some like just really light cramping on a Monday. Nothing, I wouldn't even call it early labor because it was so minimal. And then I think I stayed up all night because I couldn't sleep, and I was like watching, I think something like Sister Wives or something on TLC. I mean, it was like really, it was like trash TV, but it was just like one of those things where I couldn't really sleep, and I think I must have known that something was happening, right?
Hmm. And
And
is
so
this, so this is past your due date? Is this like 41 weeks
this is
or?
40 and 6.
Okay.
So, and my OB was, I mean, Lucy was born on June 25th. And I think that my OB scheduled an induction for like July 1st. So that must have been like 42 weeks, which is like
Mhm.
really impressive for an OB to like
Yeah.
wait that long.
Hmm.
But again, I think it was that personal connection. So I finally went to bed after watching like how many episodes of Sisters' Wives, I don't know. And I woke up in the morning, I got out of bed, and I was like, oh, wow, that's a contraction. And because I wanted an unmedicated birth, because I had kind of wanted like a home birth deep down, I had told everybody, I was like, we're going to stay at home for as long as possible. We're going to go to the hospital at the very last minute. Like, I'm not going in too early. But then I started getting these contractions, and I was like, man, these are like a lot stronger than I thought they were going to be. And I told Ryan, I was like, you know what, Ryan, I think we're probably going to go in like middle of the day. So like, let's go get breakfast. There was like a little cafe that had these really good muffins, and I really wanted a muffin from this cafe. So I was like, let's just go to Manitou Springs and get these muffins, and then we'll kind of check in. So he was like, okay. So he's getting ready, and the contractions start getting like much stronger and much closer together. And so I call my older sister, and I'm like, Suzanne, I'm like, these are really intense. And I'm like feeling them like in my thighs. And like I had a couple of contractions on the phone with her. And she was like, Monet, she's like, I think you might want to go to the hospital. And at that point, I was like, yeah, I think this is ramping up. So Ryan like comes upstairs and is like ready to go to the muffin shop. And I'm like, babe, we gotta just go to the hospital. I can't go to the muffin store. So we get in the car and we drive to the hospital. And I get to labor and delivery. And this is like one of the hospitals. I've subsequently been there as a birth photographer, and they have really like they have those rules. I don't know if any hospitals are like this, Jen, where they like won't admit you unless you're like in active labor. And by active labor, at that point in time, I think it was 6 centimeters. So like if you were less than 6 centimeters, you could not get a room. So you're going there
We
being
have
like,
that
does that
at
happen?
too many places here. It's,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. And
yeah.
it's like really hard. I always feel for my multip clients because I feel like oftentimes multips will come in at like 4 centimeters and they're
$4 centimeters. Yeah.
totally active, but like,
Yeah.
anyway. So I got there, they checked my cervix. It was like at 10 o'clock in the morning, maybe 10:30, and I was 6 centimeters. So it was like, okay, yes, like you get to get a labor and delivery room. So at that point, I had like texted, I had a birth photographer, which I'm really glad that I did. I texted my birth photographer. I had my doula. I had Ryan. I'd also invited my mom, my mother-in-law, and my older sister. Okay, so there's a lot of people in this little hospital room. And I just labored. And it was one of those births where everything is just unfolding quickly and quick enough that no one's really having to do anything because it's just happening? And so I like labored in the bed. And of course, my sweet birth photographer, she was mainly like a family photographer. She'd only done like one or two births. And of course, I come into the room and I'm like, all the blinds closed, all the lights off. At that point in time, people weren't really using external flashes. So she was working with like the worst light, I'm sure, imaginable. But it was what I needed. And at that point, I really wasn't thinking about the photography piece. But it was so cool because, she was there for my whole labor, but I don't ever remember. I remember her being there, but it was just like this kind of like calm, peaceful presence. She had like six babies of her own. So she was just like one of those experienced moms, and things just unfolded. And I kind of got through transition. And at that point, they decided to my OB was not on call the day that I was in labor, but she had agreed to special my birth. So she came in during her lunch break. So I'd gotten there at 10:30. She must have come in around like 12:30 or maybe 1 o'clock. I think it was actually later. It probably was more like 1:30. She came in and she checked me and she was like, "You're 10 centimeters. Jets, this is awesome." And I was so excited. But she was like, "Well, I'm going to go back to my office and the nurse will call me when you're close to having the baby because, you know how it can be with first-time moms, they can push for a really long time." And I remember being so discouraged that like I was like, I
That's
cannot do
hard.
this
Hmm.
for, 3 more hours. I can't believe she's leaving to go back to see patients. Like this is awful, right?
Hmm.
So then I started pushing and with the first push, the nurse like looked at my husband and was like, "I'm gonna make a phone call real quick." And I could hear her on the phone and she called my doctor and she was like, "Yeah," she was like, "I think you probably need to turn around. Like, I think the baby's coming soon." And so sure enough, my daughter was born like 15 minutes later. I only pushed for like probably like 15, 20 minutes. I had wanted Ryan to catch the baby. And it's so funny, Jen, because like in the pictures, like they made him like gown up, like almost like he was going for
Right.
a C-section. Like he had these like yellow scrubs from like head to toe. They gave him gloves. He didn't even catch the baby because she just came out so quick. But I'm just like, what, like why did they do this? Like, why did they make,
Yes.
I don't understand.
Makes no sense.
It makes no sense. It's like I think he's been exposed to my bodily fluids at this point. Like why is he in full on scrubs? But whatever. That was the thing that they did.
Hmm.
She was born and she came straight to my chest and I think it is just like one of the most indescribable ecstatic moments of human existence. I remember just being completely in shock. I was floored. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I was like the highest of high, it was just, out of body, everything, fireworks, everything that you could think or imagine or want for, your first birth.
Yeah. And
Minus the hospital stuff, but
and
yeah,
when it's so fast like that too, you really don't have time to overthink it.
no.
You're just in it.
No, exactly. And I had really prepared myself. I was like, it's gonna be like 20 hours. I prepared
Mhm.
myself for a marathon. And from the first contraction to her in my arms was 6 hours, which is really, really fast for a first
So
baby.
fast.
And so it was just like total shock. I was in the hospital then for, a couple of days. I went back home and I think, with a first baby especially, it's such a steep learning curve, right? Like
Yeah.
it's such a, you know, even if your birth goes really well, I think those first days and weeks, like it's so intense. And
It's a lot.
I don't think you realize how intense birth is going to be. And I also don't think you really don't realize how intense postpartum is going to
Newborns
be.
are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I just remember, like your boobs are engorged and you're like, I had had stitches and like, I mean, it was just like, I just
Mhm.
felt totally, it was kind of a mess, and looking back, maybe there was some postpartum depression and anxiety. I don't know, but it was definitely like, my pregnancy was great. My birth was great. Postpartum was really, really hard for me. But all of that to say, I remember it must have been a couple of weeks after she had been born, and we were still kind of in the thick of that, like postpartum, just exhaustion and physical kind of intensity. And I was up in the middle of the night, of course, feeding the baby. And I got an email on my phone and it was my birth photos. And my birth photographer had made like a slideshow, so it was like she didn't take any footage, but it was like a slideshow of the birth story. I opened up that email and I watched it, and it was just like, I mean, of course, the actual birth, all of those feelings are so intense because you're in it. But it was like the closest thing to that when I watched that birth video because I was like
Yeah.
reliving and I was also seeing things from my birth that I didn't even remember happened.
Mhm.
My mom's face, my sister's face, Ryan's face, all of these details, all of these moments, I had been so internal that I had missed really my whole
Right.
birth. I mean, it really
Yeah.
was like I would like went to this place where I wasn't perceiving anything else.
Hmm.
Anyway, so I am just like bawling, like watching this video. And Ryan like wakes up and he like looks over and he like sees me crying and he's like, "Oh my God, like what's wrong?
What's
Like, are you
wrong?
okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm totally okay. You have to watch this." And so we watched it again together and we were both just like moved to tears. And it was just, for me at least, like I think one of the most important and one of the best things that I did.
Hmm.
And I'm so grateful that like I was able to make it happen because again at that time it just wasn't a very popular or easy
Right.
space. Like, I really it only happened to come into fruition because my birth photographer was a family friend and someone that I knew well. It wasn't like I
Hmm.
was like Googling birth photographers and found somebody. But it was so instrumental for me because I realized and I recognized like the power of what we do. And,
Yeah. And the power
obviously,
of birth. I mean,
yes, exactly. Yeah.
mhm.
For me, it was more than just like my daughter being born. And, she's almost 11 and I love her I mean, we're so close. But, it was obviously her birth and her beginning, but it was also such a crucial ritual transformation experience for me as a human being and one that changed me forever. And I do think that, like, in our culture and in our world and our society, we have turned birth into this kind of like medical event or medical
Right.
procedure that you go through.
Hmm.
And I think it does a disservice because I think for most people, even if your birth is really intense and traumatic, I still think it is one of the most transformative experiences that we have as human beings. And that's why I feel like it is so important and valuable to invest, obviously, time, money, resources into making that birth as special and as meaningful as possible. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So
So
important.
that's my first birth story. And then I subsequently have gone on to have three more babies, three more births, and you, Jen, were able to be part of all of those birth stories. So
Yes.
that is really special. And I'm sure we'll share our other birth stories later episodes, but we wanted to kind of both share our beginnings as
Hmm.
moms, as parents, and to be honest, I think for both of us, our own first birth stories really influenced our decision to become birth photographers ourselves. So,
Absolutely. Yep.
yeah, very much kind of at the foundation of both of our stories in different ways. And
Hmm.
I think that's really cool to have that to have to both for both of us to have that origin.
Yeah. And I think I didn't have photos. And so to not know how powerful birth is, even though my birth didn't turn out the way I wanted it or hoped that it would, like it's interesting to hear you have that experience and then to have that experience reliving your birth photos. Because now we've relived hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of birth galleries and birth stories, over and over again. But to have that experience the very first time with your own gallery, your own first birth, I bet that's really cool. And I bet it's cool to like look back and even at that memory, right?
Yeah,
Like, yeah,
totally.
that's really neat.
And it's also, I mentioned that I had I was like, it was a dark cave, like I had every
Right,
light off. These photos are not like, I mean, they're not like my subsequent births, which you photographed, which are like
right.
pretty beautiful, spectacular birth photos. These were like grainy and dimly lit and not
But
like,
they're good.
they
Yeah,
were
I've
good,
seen
but
them.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
yeah,
but they weren't
yeah,
like, they're not like these
right.
award-winning birth, but for
Sure.
me as the mom, like it literally doesn't matter. And I think that should
No.
be an
Hmm.
encouragement to anyone who's starting out and feeling like I don't know if my work is gonna like it's okay because you're
Right.
documenting something for somebody that is so important and so monumental that anything you give them will be an absolute gift.
Right.
So yeah, just don't feel too much like imposter syndrome because truly having anything is is more than a lot of people have,
Yeah.
and it really, really matters to
It,
folks in the days and the years to come.
yeah, it really does. I would have loved to have had those memories, but I will say it does turn on your internal memory. Like I
Yes,
have, memories of my birth differently, but I know it's so powerful and it changed like my trajectory in life. So I
yes,
completely agree.
absolutely.
Do we want to do our little when would you go to a birth?
Yes, let's do that. So this was a third birth. It was a home birth, and her second birth was precipitous. They barely made it to the hospital from her retelling of her second birth story. They barely made it to the hospital. It was a precipitous birth. So she went into labor, and I was actually finishing up at another birth. And thankfully, the baby was already born. So when I got that first text message, I was like, okay, this is fine because I can really leave at any point and go to this birth. So she sent a text message and she said, hey, I'm having contractions. They're coming like every 10-ish minutes. And I was like, okay. I was like, well, I was like, I'm at this other birth. I'm finishing up. Keep me updated. I can either go straight from the hospital to your house, or I can go home and then wait for your text. So I was leaving the hospital like an hour or two later, and she said, okay, they're like 7 to 8 minutes apart. And I was like, okay, well, you want me to come to your house or go home? And she's like, you can go home. So I went home. And then the next update I got was from the midwife. And the midwife said, her contractions are starting to get a little bit stronger. They're still about 7 minutes apart. I think I'm gonna head over and be there within like an hour. So the question is, when would you have gone at that point? 7 minutes apart, getting stronger. Midwife is going to be there in an hour.
I mean, how far is your drive?
15 to 20 minutes.
I would do things differently with that drive. I would probably just wait and see what the midwife said before going over, because generally the midwife would check the cervix and check out contraction patterns and then let me know. But I'm about 45 minutes to an hour from my clients, so I probably would have planned on arriving around the same time as the midwife, just in the event that things were getting more intense. But sometimes that leaves me in for a long
Right.
birth.
So typically I would follow that advice and I would have waited until the midwife had gone over. But I think because like I was already kind of awake from that, like, I had that adrenaline from that
Yeah,
first
it's hard to
birth.
like crash and then get
Yeah,
up and
and
go
I knew
again.
I was
Yeah.
like, I know that this is probably going to happen tonight. So I was like, okay, I'm going to breastfeed Grover and then I'm just going to get ready to go. And my plan was like, I'm going to try to get there around the time the midwife gets there. So I breastfeed Grover and I really take my time and I like go into the kitchen and I'm packing like all of the snacks. I'm like getting all of these treats and snacks and food and, because I'm kind of preparing like this could be all night long. You don't
Hmm.
know, right? 7 minutes
Right. You
apart,
never
go
know.
either way. So I get in the car, I drive over, and when I'm like probably like 5 minutes from their house, the midwife texts me again and said, 2 to 3 minutes apart, she's feeling pushy. She's in the bathroom. And I was like, oh shoot. So I like speed the rest
Zoomed
I don't
over.
speed, but I'm going quickly to the house. I get in. The midwife isn't there. Mom is like on all fours in the bed, and it's very evident that like we're about to have a baby. So I like call the midwife, I put her on speakerphone. The dad is like trying to like set up the birth tub in the living room, and I'm like, I don't think we're gonna be able to fill this
Not
up.
gonna work.
So maybe we just like stay in here because I really like I don't really want to catch a baby. I would always rather like the partner catch the baby. So I was like, why don't you stay in here in case the baby comes out? Anyway, midwife got there. And then within like 5 minutes of her arrival, we had a baby girl. So it was super fast. And again, like I really wasn't panicked at all when she said 7 minutes apart, but it just goes to show you,
Right.
especially with a multip and someone that has had precipitous births, you can go from like 7 minutes apart to like 2 minutes apart
Real
really
quick.
quickly. And
Yeah.
when it happens, then you better be on your way or you're going to miss the birth. So, anyway, it was a wild, wild, beautiful birth. And I was very glad that I made it and very glad that I got that text message when I was like 5 minutes away and not.
Right.
That's the worst text message to get when you're still at your house. It's like the
Yeah.
worst.
Oh, yeah. That's
You're
no
fine.
good.
You're like, oh no. So yeah, I was glad that
So
I.
was the midwife, was she still within her hour time frame, or did the midwife, like, is this new information that the midwife had and she left too?
No, I think the midwife was on her way when she got
Yeah.
the
So
message,
she,
but because she had like about like a 30-40 minute drive. So she was already en route. But again, she wasn't really rushing over either. And so I think that the
right.
hour was kind of like, I'm getting
Mm-hmm.
ready, I'm gonna be there, but not like, she's not racing out the door or
Right.
driving like,
I know it does change. It changes so quickly.
it does.
I think I actually was talking to you on the phone and I had a client that I was driving to her third birth, and the midwife texted while I was driving and said, take your time. Things are a little slow here. And I said that to you, and I was like, oh, shoot. Well, I'm a half an hour away. I guess I'll still keep going. And then 10 minutes later, the midwife said, actually, things are really picking up. Hurry up.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I was just still on my way. So there was nothing I could have done. I just
No,
kept going,
no.
but I made it.
Yeah.
It was good, but it was only a few minutes to spare. So,
Yeah. I think those third births, especially,
third, yeah,
are hard. I think even especially when you have more babies, like fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh babies, I think it even gets
even harder, I
harder
think. Yeah.
because you really can have really spaced out contractions up until like the very, very end. And
Mhm.
that can be hard to know. Like, do I go? Do I wait? Am I gonna miss it? It's definitely, I don't think people understand the mental energy that goes into just
Yeah,
deciding when to get into
absolutely.
your car, like that, like you're doing a lot of work for people before you even get to their house or the hospital,
Right.
because that timing piece is really, really critical. And again, like, yes, you could go early and play it safe, but sometimes that means you're there for 24, 48 hours, and that's not really the best situation
Mhm.
for you or for your client, to be honest. It's not easy to go into labor when you have people sitting in your living room watching you.
Mhm.
Ideally, you really do want to wait until that active labor has really set in, for everybody's sake. Can be tricky. Labor is not like this linear line as much
Yeah.
as,
It's not on anybody's
no,
schedule, that's for
it's not.
sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for listening to our first birth stories. And like we mentioned,
Yeah.
we'll share more from our subsequent births in the weeks and months ahead.
Thanks for tuning in. Find out more about us, our courses, and other tools for birth photography at birthbecomesyou.com. And make sure to follow along on Instagram and Facebook at Birth Becomes You. And if you love listening, make sure to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and subscribe wherever you listen. Thanks. Catch you on the flip side.